For most of human history, extinction was something people rarely witnessed in real time. Species disappeared slowly, quietly, over thousands of years, usually long before anyone could fully understand what was being lost. But the modern world changed that rhythm. For the first time in the history of life on Earth, humans did not just live alongside other species. They began to outpace them, outhunt them, and in some cases erase them within the span of a single lifetime. This is what makes the story of extinct and nearly extinct animals so unsettling. It is no longer only about natural selection or distant prehistoric change. It is about moments that were seen, recorded, photographed, and sometimes ignored until it was too late. Across the last few centuries, there have been chilling turning points when the final individuals of once abundant species were still alive, still breathing, still moving through a world that was rapidly closing in around them. The last dodo walking the shores of Mauritius, the final passenger pigeon flying over a continent that once held billions, the lonely Tasmanian tiger pacing behind the bars of a zoo enclosure while the camera quietly recorded the end of an entire lineage. These moments carry a different emotional weight than ancient extinctions. They feel close, uncomfortably close, because in many of these cases, humans were not distant observers of a natural process. They were active participants in the chain of events that led to disappearance. Overhunting, habitat destruction, introduced species, and industrial expansion created pressures that many animals simply could not adapt to quickly enough. Yet the most haunting aspect of these stories is not only the loss itself, but the timing. In several cases, warnings existed. Populations were visibly collapsing. Some voices even raised concern, but collective action came slowly, sometimes just a few years too late, and that narrow window between still recoverable and already gone is where the most powerful historical lessons live. Because extinction, especially in the modern era, is rarely a single dramatic moment. It is usually a sequence of small delays, underestimated risks, and gradual normalization of decline. By the time the final individual appears in a photograph or record, the real turning point has often passed unnoticed years earlier. In this journey, we are going to step carefully into those final moments, not to sensationalize them, but to understand what they reveal about human behavior, environmental pressure, and the fragile boundary between survival and disappearance. In most extinction stories, the final moment receives all the attention. The last photograph, the last sighting, the last lonely individual standing at the edge of disappearance. But history rarely collapses in a single dramatic second. Long before the final individual is gone, there are earlier moments, quieter, easier to ignore, and far more revealing. These are the first moments when something begins to go wrong. The first unexplained population drops. The first regions where a species quietly disappears. The first warnings that seem small enough to dismiss. In the case of many now extinct animals, the beginning did not look like a crisis. It looked like a minor fluctuation, the kind nature had always produced. Hunters noticed fewer sightings but assumed the animals had simply moved. Traders reported declining numbers but believed the populations would recover. Even early naturalists, in some cases, documented the decline without fully grasping its speed or finality. This is what makes the early phase of extinction so psychologically dangerous. Nothing appears urgent. Nothing appears irreversible. The change is real, but it is gradual enough to blend into the background of normal life. Human perception is poorly calibrated for this kind of slow collapse. We are highly sensitive to sudden disasters, fires, floods, wars, but far less responsive to steady downward trends that unfold across years or decades. As a result, the earliest warning signals of extinction often pass through societies with surprisingly little resistance. By the time concern becomes widespread, the biological momentum of decline may already be difficult to reverse. In several historical cases, the first documented drops in population occurred decades before serious protective measures were even considered. During that window, sometimes only a generation long, the fate of entire species quietly tilted toward the point of no return. What is most unsettling is that many of these early moments were visible. They were recorded in hunting logs, shipping records, and field observations. The data existed, the pattern was forming, but the human response system moved slowly, fragmented by economic interests, limited communication, and a persistent optimism that nature would correct itself as it always had before. These first moments of decline rarely feel dramatic, while they are happening. Only in hindsight do they reveal their true weight, and that is precisely why they matter. Because the history of extinction is not only a story about endings, it is a story about beginnings that were too quiet to trigger alarm, until silence was all that remained. The story of the dodo is one of the most quietly unsettling extinction narratives in human history, not because it unfolded in deep prehistory, but because it happened in the early modern world, at a moment when human expansion was accelerating faster than ecological understanding. The dodo, scientifically known as Rhapis cucullatus, was a large, flightless bird that lived exclusively on the remote island of Mauritius in the Indian Ocean. For millions of years, the species evolved in near total isolation, with no natural mammalian predators on the island. The dodo developed in an environment where fear-based survival behaviors were largely unnecessary. It grew heavy-bodied, ground-nesting, and remarkably unwary of large animals. From an evolutionary standpoint, this made perfect sense within the stable ecological bubble of Mauritius. But the very traits that once made the dodo successful would later become fatal vulnerabilities. When Dutch sailors first arrived on Mauritius in the late 16th century, they encountered a bird that had never learned to fear humans. Contemporary accounts describe the dodo as approachable, slow-moving, and easy to capture. Early visitors often portrayed the bird as clumsy or foolish, a characterization that would later shape the dodo's enduring cultural reputation. However, modern ecological analysis suggests the bird was not inherently unintelligent. It was simply adapted to an environment that had never required rapid escape behavior. The true danger did not come from direct hunting alone. Although sailors and settlers did kill dodos for food, the more devastating impact came from the ecological shock that followed human arrival. Ships brought with them rats, pigs, monkeys, and other invasive species that quickly spread across the island. Unlike the adult dodos, which were large and somewhat resilient, their eggs were extremely vulnerable. Ground nests that had once been safe for millennia suddenly became easy targets for newly introduced predators. This shift triggered a classic but devastating ecological cascade. Dodo reproduction rates, already relatively slow, could not keep pace with the new level of egg predation. At the same time, human settlement gradually altered the island's vegetation, further reducing the bird's stable habitat. What makes the dodo's decline especially haunting is how quickly it appears to have unfolded. Within less than a century of sustained human presence, reliable sightings of the bird became increasingly rare. By the late 17th century, the dodo had effectively vanished. The exact date of the final individual's death is unknown, which in itself is psychologically revealing. Unlike later extinctions that were documented in real time, the dodo disappeared during a transitional period when global exploration had expanded, but systematic biological monitoring had not yet matured. In other words, the species slipped through the narrowing window of early modern awareness. Another striking aspect of the dodo story is how its cultural image diverged from its biological reality, because many early European descriptions emphasized the bird's tameness and awkward movement. The dodo quickly became a symbol of foolishness in popular imagination. Over time, the phrase "dead as a dodo" entered common language, reinforcing the idea that the species' extinction was somehow inevitable or even deserved. Yet this interpretation obscures the deeper lesson. The dodo did not fail because it was poorly designed. For millions of years, it was perfectly adapted to its environment. What changed was the speed and scale of external pressure introduced by humans and their accompanying animals. The extinction of the dodo was not the result of evolutionary incompetence. It was the result of ecological mismatch created almost overnight. Modern research has also revealed how incomplete early records of the dodo actually were. No fully preserved soft tissue specimen survives from the period when the species was alive. Much of what we know comes from fragmentary remains, subfossil bones, and artistic reconstructions of varying reliability. Even today, the exact appearance, posture, and behavior of the living dodo remain partially reconstructed through scientific inference. This fragmentary legacy adds another layer of unease to the story. The dodo is both one of the most famous extinct animals and one of the least directly observed in life by modern scientific standards. It became iconic precisely because it vanished at the threshold of the modern biological age. From a broader historical perspective, the extinction of the dodo marks an early warning signal in the emerging pattern of human-driven biodiversity loss. It demonstrated long before the industrial era reached full momentum that relatively small and geographically isolated ecosystems could collapse rapidly under combined pressure from hunting, invasive species, and habitat disruption. At the time, however, the story of the passenger pigeon is one of the most shocking population collapses ever recorded in modern history, not because the species was rare or fragile, but because it was once the most abundant bird in North America. At its peak in the early 19th century, the passenger pigeon, scientifically known as Ectopistes migratorius, existed in numbers so vast that early observers struggled to describe them without sounding exaggerated. Flocks were reported to stretch for miles across the sky, sometimes taking hours to fully pass overhead. Contemporary accounts describe the sun being briefly darkened by the sheer density of birds in flight. In ecological terms, the passenger pigeon was not merely common, it was dominant. For thousands of years before large-scale European settlement, the species thrived across the eastern forests of North America. Its survival strategy depended heavily on massive flocking behavior. Passenger pigeons nested, migrated, and fed in extraordinarily large colonies, a pattern that provided strong protection against natural predators. When millions of birds moved together, individual risk was diluted. This strategy had been highly successful in the pre-industrial ecosystem, but it also created a hidden vulnerability that would only become apparent once human pressure intensified. The pigeon's entire reproductive system was optimized for abundance. They nested in dense clusters, often concentrating huge portions of the population into relatively confined areas during breeding season. What had once been a strength became a catastrophic weakness when confronted with industrial-scale hunting. By the mid-19th century, technological and economic changes dramatically altered the balance between humans and wildlife. Expanding railroad networks allowed hunters to reach remote nesting sites quickly and transport massive quantities of birds to urban markets. The telegraph system enabled near-instant communication about flock locations, turning pigeon hunting into a highly coordinated commercial enterprise. At the same time, deforestation across the eastern United States began reducing the vast hardwood forests that the species depended on for food and nesting. Unlike earlier subsistence hunting, this new industrial approach removed birds at a scale the species had never faced in its evolutionary history. What makes the passenger pigeon's decline particularly disturbing is the speed of the collapse. In the early 1800s, billions of birds filled the skies. By the 1870s, observers were already reporting noticeable declines. By the 1890s, large flocks had become rare, and in 1914, the last known passenger pigeon, a female named Martha, died in captivity at the Cincinnati Zoo. In little more than a human lifetime, the most numerous bird in North America had been driven to extinction. This rapid transition from overwhelming abundance to absolute absence stunned even many observers at the time. It exposed a dangerous assumption that had quietly shaped human thinking: the belief that extremely large populations were effectively inexhaustible. Psychologically, the passenger pigeon represents a different kind of extinction story than the dodo. The dodo was geographically isolated and numerically limited. The passenger pigeon was everywhere. Its disappearance forced a painful recalibration of human perception. It demonstrated that scale alone does not guarantee survival when exploitation becomes industrialized. In fact, the species' reliance on massive flocking may have accelerated its downfall. As populations shrank, the bird's social breeding system began to break down. Passenger pigeons required large colony sizes to successfully reproduce. Once numbers dropped below a certain threshold, their recovery became biologically difficult, even without continued heavy hunting. This phenomenon, now known as the Allais effect, was not understood at the time. The final years of the passenger pigeon are especially haunting because they unfolded within the era of photography and modern record-keeping. Martha, the last known individual, lived out her remaining years under human observation. When she died on September 1, 1914, the extinction of the species was no longer an abstract scientific conclusion. It was a documented event. Her preserved body now rests in the Smithsonian Institution, a silent physical reminder of how quickly abundance can collapse under sustained pressure. In the decades that followed, the passenger pigeon became one of the most frequently cited examples in early conservation movements. It helped shift public awareness toward the realization that human activity could eliminate even the most numerous species. Yet the lesson came only after the window for recovery had fully closed. Today, the passenger pigeon exists only in museum drawers, historical accounts, and ecological models. But its story continues to carry an uncomfortable warning that feels increasingly modern. In Campo, the story of the great auk is one of the clearest and most sobering examples of how human pressure can eliminate even a well-established and widely distributed species when exploitation becomes systematic and sustained. The great auk, scientifically known as Pinguinus impennis, was a large, flightless seabird that once inhabited the cold North Atlantic, nesting on rocky islands from eastern Canada and Greenland to Iceland, the British Isles, and parts of Scandinavia. For thousands of years, the species thrived in this harsh maritime environment, perfectly adapted to life in frigid waters where its powerful swimming ability allowed it to hunt fish with remarkable efficiency. On land, however, the great auk was slow, upright, and completely unable to fly, a combination that would ultimately seal its fate once humans began to harvest it at scale. Physically, the great auk stood nearly a meter tall, with a distinctive black and white plumage pattern and small vestigial wings that functioned more like underwater stabilizers than instruments of flight. In many ways, it resembled modern penguins, although the two were not closely related. The auk's evolutionary strategy depended on isolation and predator-free breeding grounds. It nested in dense colonies on remote rocky islands, where large terrestrial predators were historically absent. Like many island-breeding seabirds, it evolved with little behavioral fear of land-based threats. This ecological innocence had once been advantageous, conserving energy in environments where constant vigilance was unnecessary. But as with several other extinction stories, the arrival of organized human exploitation transformed this adaptive calm into a fatal vulnerability. For centuries, indigenous peoples and early European sailors harvested great auks for meat, oil, and feathers. Initially, these activities were relatively small in scale and did not immediately threaten the species' survival. The real danger emerged as commercial demand intensified during the 17th and 18th centuries. The bird's dense feathers became highly valuable for stuffing mattresses and pillows, and their predictable nesting colonies made mass harvesting disturbingly efficient. Sailors and hunters could land on breeding islands and capture large numbers of birds with minimal effort. Because the great auk could not fly and had limited mobility on land, entire colonies could be devastated in a single season. As exploitation increased, the species entered a familiar but poorly understood downward spiral. Fewer breeding adults meant fewer eggs laid. Fewer colonies meant remaining birds became easier to locate and harvest. In some cases, collectors specifically targeted the last remaining individuals for museum specimens, ironically accelerating the final phase of extinction in the name of scientific preservation. By the early 19th century, the great auk had become increasingly rare across much of its former range. Yet, as in many extinction narratives, the seriousness of the decline was not fully recognized until the population was already critically low. The final confirmed chapter of the species unfolded in 1844 on the remote Icelandic island of Eldey. There, the last known breeding pair of great auks was captured and killed by hunters who were reportedly acting on behalf of a collector seeking specimens. The birds were strangled, and the single egg present at the site was accidentally crushed during the encounter. With that moment, one of the North Atlantic's most distinctive seabirds disappeared forever. Unlike some earlier extinctions that faded gradually into uncertainty, the end of the great auk is chilling precisely because it was so directly witnessed and recorded. In retrospect, the great auk's extinction reveals several patterns that would repeat in later environmental crises. The species was not ecologically fragile in its original environment. It had survived dramatic climate fluctuations and natural predation pressures for thousands of years. What it could not withstand was the combination of commercial exploitation, technological mobility, and the absence of regulatory limits on harvest. Perhaps most haunting is the psychological dimension of the story. Even as the species became visibly rare, demand for specimens increased rather than decreased. Rarity itself became a market driver, a pattern that conservationists would later recognize as particularly dangerous for vulnerable species. Today, the great auk survives only in preserved skins, skeletal remains, and scattered historical illustrations. Yet its legacy extends far beyond museum collections. Its extinction played a quiet but important role in the early development of modern conservation awareness in Europe and North America. It demonstrated with uncomfortable clarity that even abundant marine birds could be erased within a relatively short historical window if human extraction scaled faster than biological. The story of the Carolina parakeet is one of the most quietly tragic extinction events in North American history, not because the species disappeared in deep prehistory, but because it vanished within the reach of modern memory, photography, and early scientific observation. The Carolina parakeet, scientifically known as Conuropsis carolinensis, was once the only native parrot species of the eastern United States. Unlike the tropical parrots many people associate with dense rainforests, this bird thrived across a wide range of environments, from the wooded river valleys of the Midwest to the humid forests of the Southeast. Its bright green body, yellow head, and orange facial markings made it one of the most visually striking birds in North America, and unfortunately, one of the most conspicuous targets as human settlement expanded. For centuries before large-scale European colonization, the Carolina parakeet appears to have maintained stable populations across its range. It lived in social flocks, nested in tree cavities, and fed on seeds, fruits, and agricultural crops. It was particularly associated with bottomland forests and river systems, environments that would later undergo some of the most aggressive transformation during 19th century expansion. As with many extinction stories, the species' natural behavior contained a hidden vulnerability. Carolina parakeets were highly social and strongly attached to their flock members. When one bird was injured or killed, others often returned to the site, circling and calling rather than immediately fleeing. Under natural conditions, this social cohesion had advantages. Under sustained human hunting pressure, it became devastatingly maladaptive. By the early 19th century, the pressures on the species began to multiply. Large-scale deforestation for agriculture and timber steadily reduced the mature forests the birds depended on for nesting. At the same time, farmers increasingly viewed the parakeets as crop pests, particularly in orchards. Shooting the birds became common practice in some regions. Their bright plumage also made them attractive targets for the millinery trade, which demanded colorful feathers for women's hats during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These overlapping pressures, habitat loss, direct hunting, and feather trade exploitation, created a slow but persistent population decline. Yet what makes the Carolina parakeet's extinction particularly unsettling is how poorly the collapse was documented in real time. Unlike the passenger pigeon, whose enormous flocks made its decline highly visible, the parakeet disappeared more quietly in fragmented regional losses that did not immediately trigger widespread alarm. Early naturalists noted shrinking populations, but the process unfolded unevenly across its range. By the late 1800s, the species had already vanished from large portions of the northern United States. Still, no comprehensive conservation response emerged. Another possible contributing factor, still debated among researchers, was disease. Some evidence suggests that poultry pathogens introduced by expanding domestic agriculture may have spread to wild parakeet populations. While this hypothesis remains difficult to confirm definitively, it highlights the complex web of pressures that often converge in extinction events. Rarely is there a single cause. More often, multiple stressors accumulate until the species can no longer recover. The final confirmed individual of the species, a captive bird named Incas, died at the Cincinnati Zoo in 1918. Just 4 years after Martha, the last passenger pigeon, died in the same facility. This coincidence is historically striking. Within a single generation, North America lost both its most abundant native bird and its only native parrot. Yet the Carolina parakeet's disappearance never fully penetrated public consciousness in the way the passenger pigeon's collapse did. Its extinction was quieter, more fragmented, and therefore in some ways more haunting. Today, the Carolina parakeet exists only in museum skins, preserved specimens, and scattered written accounts. No confirmed wild sightings have occurred for more than a century. Its loss represents not only the disappearance of a species, but the erasure of a unique ecological role from the forests of eastern North America. More broadly, its story reveals a recurring and uncomfortable pattern in environmental history. Extinction does not always announce itself with dramatic population crashes. Sometimes it proceeds through slow fragmentation, local disappearances, and a gradual normalization of absence, until one day The silence is permanent. The story of the moa is one of the most dramatic examples of rapid human-driven extinction in pre-modern history, not because the birds were fragile or already declining, but because they had dominated their environment for millions of years before humans arrived and then vanished within only a few centuries. The moa were a group of large, flightless birds native to New Zealand, belonging to the order Dinornithiformes. Unlike many extinction stories that unfold across long industrial timelines, the disappearance of the moa occurred in a relatively compressed historical window, following the arrival of Polynesian settlers, the ancestors of the Maori, in the late 13th century. This makes the moa one of the clearest case studies of how quickly human expansion can reshape isolated ecosystems that evolved without land-based mammalian predators. Before human arrival, New Zealand was an ecological world apart. For tens of millions of years, the islands developed in extreme isolation. Terrestrial mammals were almost entirely absent, and birds filled many of the ecological roles that mammals occupied elsewhere. In this unique environment, moa diversified into multiple species ranging dramatically in size. The largest, such as Dinornis robustus, could reach heights of over 3 meters when the neck was fully extended, making them among the tallest birds that ever lived. Despite their size, moa were herbivores, browsing on leaves, twigs, and forest vegetation, with no native human hunters and few natural predators beyond the massive Haast's eagle. They evolved with little behavioral fear of ground-based threats. This long period of evolutionary calm created the same hidden vulnerability seen in several other island extinctions. The moa were biologically successful within their original ecosystem, but were poorly prepared for sudden, sustained human predation. When Polynesian settlers reached New Zealand around the late 1200s, they encountered large, slow-moving birds that had never evolved defensive strategies against coordinated human hunters. Archaeological evidence from early Maori settlement sites reveals extensive moa bone deposits, many showing clear butchering marks. These remains indicate that moa quickly became a major food source for the growing human population. What makes the moa extinction particularly striking is the speed of the collapse. Based on radiocarbon dating and archaeological patterns, most moa species appear to have been driven to extinction within roughly 150 to 200 years after sustained human hunting began. In evolutionary terms, this is an extremely rapid disappearance for such large animals. Several factors likely accelerated the decline. First, moa reproduction rates were relatively slow, meaning populations could not quickly replace heavy losses. Second, widespread burning of forests by early settlers altered key habitats. Third, the birds' lack of evolved fear responses made them highly vulnerable to organized hunting strategies. Unlike some later extinction events, the moa vanished before the age of photography or detailed biological monitoring. There are no direct visual records of living moa. Everything we know about their appearance and behavior comes from skeletal remains, preserved eggshell fragments, coprolites, and early Maori oral traditions that appear to reference encounters with the birds. Yet even without photographs, the ecological impact of their disappearance is unmistakable. The extinction of the moa triggered cascading changes throughout New Zealand's ecosystem. Most notably, it contributed directly to the extinction of the Haast's eagle, the giant raptor that had specialized in hunting moa. With its primary prey gone, the eagle itself soon followed into extinction, a powerful example of how removing one dominant species can destabilize entire ecological networks. The moa story also carries a subtle psychological lesson that resonates strongly with modern environmental history. The Polynesian settlers who hunted the birds were not industrial exploiters operating with modern technology. They were skilled navigators and hunters using relatively simple tools compared to later colonial societies. Yet even at this earlier technological level, sustained human pressure proved sufficient to eliminate multiple large species in a short time frame. This reveals an uncomfortable truth. Large-scale extinction does not always require modern industry. Under the right ecological conditions, particularly on isolated islands, even pre-industrial human expansion can produce irreversible biological consequences. Today, the MOA survives only through reconstructed skeletons in museums and the growing body of paleogenetic research that continues to refine our understanding of these remarkable birds. But their disappearance remains one of the clearest historical warnings about the fragility of isolated ecosystems when confronted with sudden human arrival. For millions of years, the story of Haast's eagle is one of the most extraordinary and haunting predator extinctions in the natural world, because it represents the sudden disappearance of a truly dominant apex hunter that had ruled its ecosystem for thousands of years. Known scientifically as Hieraetus moorei, formerly Harpagornis moorei, Haast's eagle was native exclusively to New Zealand and is widely considered the largest eagle that has ever existed, with an estimated wingspan reaching up to 3 meters and powerful talons capable of exerting immense crushing force. This bird was not merely a large raptor by modern standards. It was a specialized megafaunal predator, uniquely adapted to hunt prey far larger than those targeted by most living eagles today. For millions of years before human arrival, New Zealand evolved in relative isolation, producing one of the most unusual ecological systems on Earth. With no native land mammals except a few species of bats, birds came to dominate nearly every major ecological niche. The moa, a group of large, flightless herbivorous birds, filled the role that large grazing mammals occupied elsewhere. In response, Haast's eagle evolved into a powerful aerial hunter, capable of bringing down prey several times its own body weight. This predator-prey relationship between eagle and moa formed one of the most remarkable examples of island-driven evolutionary specialization ever documented. Physically, Haast's eagle combined relatively broad wings with an extremely robust body and disproportionately massive talons. Unlike soaring eagles that rely on wide open skies, this species was adapted for rapid ambush attacks within forested environments. Paleobiological analysis suggests it likely hunted by diving at high speed from above, using its weight and talon strength to deliver a catastrophic impact strike to the back or pelvis of large moa. Some reconstructions indicate that a full-grown Haast's eagle could kill prey weighing well over 100 kilograms. In the pre-human ecosystem of New Zealand, there were no other predators capable of challenging its dominance. For thousands of years, this system remained stable. But like many highly specialized apex predators, Haast's eagle depended heavily on the continued abundance of its primary prey. When Polynesian settlers, the ancestors of the Maori, arrived in New Zealand in the late 13th century, they began hunting moa extensively for food. Archaeological evidence shows that within roughly 150 to 200 years, most moa species had been driven to extinction. This rapid collapse of the eagle's primary food source triggered a classic top predator vulnerability. Without sufficient large prey, Haast's eagle faced a severe ecological bottleneck. Unlike more flexible predators that can shift to smaller prey, Haast's eagle appears to have been highly specialized for hunting large-bodied birds. As moa populations plummeted, the eagle's ability to sustain viable breeding populations likely declined sharply. Habitat changes caused by widespread forest burning by early human settlers may have compounded the pressure by altering hunting environments. Within a relatively short historical window, Likely by the 15th century, Haast's eagle itself disappeared. What makes this extinction particularly chilling is how it illustrates the cascading nature of ecological collapse. Humans did not directly hunt Haast's eagle to extinction at large scale. Instead, by removing the foundational prey species, they destabilized the predator's entire survival framework. This indirect extinction pathway is one of the most important lessons embedded in the story. Ecosystems are not collections of isolated species, they are tightly interdependent networks. When a dominant herbivore disappears, the apex predator that depends on it may quietly follow. There is also a powerful psychological dimension to the Haast's eagle narrative. For the early Maori settlers, the moa represented an obvious and valuable food source. The eagle, far more elusive and less frequently encountered, likely did not initially appear to be under comparable threat. Yet the fate of the predator was already sealed once the prey base collapsed below a critical threshold. This delayed feedback effect is common in ecological systems and often difficult for human observers to recognize in real time. Today, Haast's eagle survives only through fossil remains, skeletal reconstructions, and a growing body of biomechanical research that continues to refine our understanding of its remarkable hunting capabilities. Yet its disappearance remains one of the clearest examples of how quickly even the most dominant predators can vanish when their ecological foundations are disrupted. For thousands of years, Haast's eagle ruled the skies of New Zealand without serious competition. Then, within just a few human generations, the balance shifted, and the largest eagle the world has ever known slipped permanently. The story of the quagga is one of the most visually striking and psychologically revealing extinction narratives of the modern era, because it involves an animal that lived close enough to the present to be photographed, studied, and even displayed in zoos, yet still slipped into extinction within the span of a few human generations. The quagga, scientifically known as Equus quagga, was a subspecies of the plains zebra that once inhabited the semi-arid grasslands of southern Africa, particularly in what is now South Africa. What made the quagga instantly recognizable was its unusual and asymmetrical appearance. Unlike the fully striped plains zebra, the quagga had bold, dark stripes across the head and neck that gradually faded into a mostly plain brown body toward the rear. This unique pattern gave the animal an almost transitional look, as if evolution itself had paused midway through the striping process. For thousands of years before large-scale European colonization of southern Africa, quagga populations appear to have remained relatively stable within their native ecosystem. They lived in herds across open grasslands and likely played a normal ecological role similar to other grazing equids. However, the 19th century brought rapid environmental and economic changes that dramatically altered their survival prospects. As European settlers expanded agricultural and pastoral activity across the region, competition for grazing land intensified. Quaggas were increasingly viewed not as wildlife components of the ecosystem, but as direct competitors with livestock, particularly sheep and cattle. This perception marked the beginning of sustained, systematic pressure on the population. Unlike some earlier extinctions that unfolded through ecological cascades alone, the quagga's decline was driven heavily by direct human hunting combined with habitat encroachment. Large numbers were shot both for their hides and to reduce perceived competition with domesticated animals. Because quaggas lived in relatively accessible open terrain and did not initially display extreme wariness toward mounted hunters armed with firearms, harvesting them became disturbingly efficient. At the time, there was little widespread recognition that the population was finite. As with the passenger pigeon in North America, abundance created a dangerous illusion of inexhaustibility. What makes the quagga's story particularly haunting is how late serious concern emerged. By the mid to late 19th century, wild populations had already declined sharply across much of their range. Yet systematic conservation measures were virtually non-existent. The species was still common enough in memory that its disappearance did not immediately trigger widespread alarm. Meanwhile, a small number of individuals were captured for zoos in Europe, where they became objects of scientific curiosity and public display. Among these was the most famous individual, a female quagga that would later become the last known member of the subspecies. In 1883, at the Artis Zoo in Amsterdam, the final known quagga died in captivity. At the time of her death, the full significance of the loss was not yet widely understood. Only afterward did naturalists fully grasp that the subspecies had completely vanished from the wild. The quagga thus became one of the first extinct animals to have been photographed alive, a detail that gives its story a particularly modern and unsettling edge. Unlike the dodo or the moa, which exist primarily in drawings and bones, the quagga's living image survives in early photography, making its disappearance feel uncomfortably recent. In the 20th century, the quagga gained renewed scientific attention when genetic analysis confirmed its close relationship to the plains zebra. This discovery reshaped understanding of the animal, revealing that it was not a separate species, but a geographically distinct subspecies with a unique striping pattern. In response, the Quagga Project was launched in South Africa in an attempt to selectively breed plains zebras that display reduced striping patterns similar to the original quagga. While these efforts have produced animals that visually resemble historical quaggas, the original genetic lineage remains extinct. The project itself has become a powerful symbol of both scientific ambition and the irreversible nature of true extinction. The quagga's disappearance carries a particularly modern psychological lesson. Unlike prehistoric megafauna losses, its extinction occurred during a period when scientific institutions, photography, and global communication already existed. The warning signs were visible. The decline was observable. Yet coordinated protection came too late. This places the quagga at a critical historical threshold, close enough to modern awareness to feel preventable, yet early enough that conservation systems had not fully matured. Today, the quagga survives only in museum. The story of Steller's sea cow is one of the most astonishingly rapid large animal extinctions ever recorded, not because the species had been declining for millennia, but because it was discovered by science and driven to extinction within the span of a single human lifetime. The animal, scientifically known as Hydrodamalus gigas, was an enormous marine herbivore belonging to the same broader group as modern manatees and dugongs. Yet in scale and ecological presence, Steller's sea cow was something far more imposing. Fully grown individuals could reach lengths of up to 8 or 9 meters and weigh several tons, making them among the largest herbivorous marine mammals of the Holocene epoch. For thousands of years before human contact, Steller's sea cows inhabited the cold coastal waters of the North Pacific, particularly around the Commander Islands near the Bering Sea. Their evolutionary history suggests that they were once more widely distributed, but by the time Europeans encountered them in the 18th century, their range had already contracted to this relatively isolated region. In this remote environment, the animals had evolved a slow-moving, near-surface feeding lifestyle, grazing primarily on kelp forests in shallow coastal waters. With thick, bark-like skin, paddle-shaped forelimbs, and no true dorsal fin, they were highly specialized for this niche. Crucially, they had no significant natural predators in their final habitat and appear to have evolved with very little fear of large surface threats. This ecological calm ended abruptly in 1741 when the German naturalist Georg Wilhelm Steller encountered the species during the ill-fated expedition of Danish explorer Vitus Bering. Steller's detailed descriptions provided the first scientific record of the animal, noting both its immense size and its notably gentle, slow-moving behavior. Ironically, the same traits that allowed the species to thrive for millennia in predator-poor waters made it extraordinarily vulnerable to human exploitation. The animals were large, floated when killed, and could be approached and harpooned with relative ease from small boats. What followed was one of the fastest documented megafaunal collapses in recorded history. News of the animal's abundance and the high value of its meat and fat spread quickly among fur traders, sailors, and hunters operating in the North Pacific. Steller's sea cow provided an exceptionally rich food source for crews traveling through the harsh Bering Sea region. Because the species had an extremely limited geographic range and likely reproduced slowly, it was biologically incapable of sustaining even moderate sustained harvesting pressure. Within just 27 years of its scientific discovery, the species was gone. The last confirmed sighting of Steller's sea cow occurred in 1768. From first detailed description to total extinction, the entire documented history of the species fits within less than 3 decades. This compression in time is what makes the story so uniquely unsettling. Many extinction narratives involve long, gradual declines that only become obvious in retrospect. Steller's sea cow, by contrast, demonstrates how quickly a large, well-established species can disappear once intensive human exploitation reaches an isolated and biologically unprepared population. Another important dimension of this extinction lies in its geographic isolation. Because the remaining population was confined to the Commander Islands, there was no broader refuge where surviving individuals could retreat. Once local numbers dropped below a viable threshold, recovery became impossible. This pattern, heavy exploitation combined with restricted range, has since been recognized as one of the most dangerous extinction risk profiles in conservation biology. There is also a profound psychological aspect to the sea cow's story. Unlike earlier prehistoric extinctions, this event occurred during the early modern scientific age. Steller himself reportedly recognized the vulnerability of the species and documented its behavior in unusually careful detail. Yet even with direct observation and written warning, no protective measures were implemented in time. The economic incentives driving hunting were immediate and powerful, while the concept of marine conservation was still largely undeveloped. The result was a tragic mismatch between awareness and action, a pattern that would repeat in later environmental crises. Today, Steller's sea cow survives only through skeletal remains, historical illustrations, and Steller's original written accounts. No living photographs exist. No preserved soft tissue remains comparable to those of the woolly mammoth have been found. Its disappearance remains one of the clearest examples of how rapidly human expansion can erase even the largest and most seemingly secure animals when biological vulnerability, geographic isolation, and economic exploitation converge. In the cold, the story of the Tasmanian tiger, or thylacine, is one of the most haunting modern extinction narratives because it unfolded fully within the age of photography, written records, and government policy. Unlike many earlier extinct animals that vanished into deep prehistory, the thylacine disappeared under direct human observation, leaving behind film footage, photographs, and administrative documents that make its loss feel disturbingly recent. Scientifically known as Thylacinus cynocephalus, the thylacine was a large carnivorous marsupial native to Tasmania, although fossil evidence shows it once ranged across mainland Australia and New Guinea before gradually disappearing from those regions thousands of years earlier. Physically, the thylacine presented a striking example of convergent evolution. Although it was a marsupial, not a true placental wolf or dog, its body shape closely resembled that of a medium-sized canine predator. It had a stiff tail, powerful jaws, and the distinctive dark stripes across its lower back that gave rise to the name Tasmanian tiger. This superficial similarity to wolves likely influenced both public perception and the hostility it later faced from European settlers. In its native ecosystem, the thylacine functioned as an apex or near-apex predator, hunting small to medium-sized animals in Tasmania's forests and grasslands. For thousands of years prior to European colonization, thylacine populations appear to have remained relatively stable in Tasmania, where the absence of large placental predators allowed the species to maintain its ecological niche. However, the 19th century brought rapid and destabilizing change. European settlers introduced sheep farming on a large scale, transforming landscapes and economic priorities. The thylacine quickly became labeled, fairly or not, as a significant threat to livestock. Whether the species actually caused widespread sheep losses remains debated among modern researchers, but the perception of danger proved far more consequential than the ecological reality. By the late 1800s, the Tasmanian government had instituted bounty programs that paid hunters for each thylacine killed. This policy dramatically accelerated the decline. Combined with habitat loss, possible disease pressures, and competition with introduced dogs, the population entered a steady downward spiral. What makes the thylacine story especially disturbing is how visible the warning signs were. Naturalists and some observers began expressing concern about the species' rarity in the early 20th century. Yet protective legislation came slowly and was implemented only after the population had already reached critically low levels. The final confirmed wild thylacine was killed in 1930, but the species' symbolic end came 6 years later. In 1936, the last known captive individual died at the Hobart Zoo in Tasmania. Perhaps the most haunting detail is that the animal reportedly died after being accidentally locked out of its sheltered sleeping area during cold weather, an almost painfully mundane end for what had once been one of Australia's most distinctive predators. By the time full legal protection for the species was enacted, it was already too late. The thylacine holds a unique emotional position among extinct animals because it is one of the few large predators whose final years were captured on moving film. The surviving footage, showing the animal pacing within its enclosure, creates an unusually direct psychological connection across time. Unlike skeletal reconstructions or artistic renderings, the thylacine appears unmistakably real, alert, breathing, and visibly alive. This visual immediacy makes its extinction particularly difficult to mentally distance or mythologize. In the decades since its disappearance, the thylacine has also become one of the most persistently reported, possibly still alive species. Numerous unconfirmed sightings have been reported in Tasmania and mainland Australia, reflecting both the human reluctance to accept final loss and the animal's powerful place in cultural memory. To date, however, no verifiable evidence of surviving individuals has emerged. Scientifically and historically, the thylacine represents a critical transitional extinction, one that occurred not in the absence of knowledge, but in the presence of incomplete action. By the early 20th century, the basic mechanisms of overexploitation and species decline were already becoming understood. Yet institutional response lagged behind ecological reality. The thylacine did not vanish because it was biologically weak or poorly adapted to its environment. It disappeared because economic pressure, policy decisions, and delayed conservation awareness converged at precisely the wrong moment. Today, the Tasmanian tiger survives in museum specimens, preserved film footage, and an enduring sense of unfinished story. Among extinct animals, it remains one of them. The story of the Irish elk is one of the most visually dramatic extinction cases of the late Ice Age, largely because of the animal's extraordinary antlers, which remain among the most impressive biological structures ever produced by a terrestrial mammal. Despite its common name, the Irish elk was not actually an elk in the modern sense, nor was it limited to Ireland. Scientifically known as Megaloceros giganteus, this giant deer once ranged across vast parts of Eurasia, from Western Europe to Siberia. Its association with Ireland comes primarily from the unusually rich fossil deposits preserved in Irish peat bogs, which have yielded some of the most complete and well-known skeletons. At its peak, the Irish elk was one of the largest deer species ever to exist. Adult males stood roughly 2 meters at the shoulder, but what truly defined the species were its enormous antlers, which could span over 3.5 meters from tip to tip and weigh up to 40 kilograms. These antlers were not weapons of predation, but structures shaped primarily by sexual selection. Like many modern deer, males likely used them in visual display and ritualized combat during mating competition. In the open steppe and parkland environments of the late Pleistocene, such oversized antlers were not necessarily a disadvantage. In fact, they may have been highly effective signals of genetic fitness in relatively open landscapes where visibility was high. For much of the late Ice Age, Irish elk populations appear to have been stable and widespread. The species thrived in the cold, open environments that dominated large parts of Eurasia during glacial periods. However, as the climate began to warm at the end of the last Ice Age, roughly 11,000 years ago, the ecological landscape underwent major transformation. Expanding forests gradually replaced the open grasslands and sparse woodlands that had previously supported large grazing herbivores. This shift altered food availability, movement patterns, and mating displays for many large mammals, including the Irish elk. For many years, a popular but oversimplified theory suggested that the Irish elk drove itself to extinction because its antlers became too large and energetically costly to maintain, an example of evolution overshooting practical limits. Modern research, however, has largely moved away from this idea. While the antlers were indeed massive, isotopic analysis of fossil remains suggests that Irish elk were generally well-nourished during much of their existence. Instead, the more widely accepted explanation involves a combination of environmental change and human pressure. As forests expanded and climate patterns shifted, suitable open habitat likely became increasingly fragmented. At the same time, anatomically modern humans were spreading across Eurasia, and archaeological evidence indicates that Irish elk were occasionally hunted. Unlike some rapid historical extinctions, the disappearance of the Irish elk appears to have been regionally uneven. Populations declined earlier in Western Europe, but persisted longer in eastern refugia, such as parts of Siberia. The final known populations likely disappeared around 7,000 to 8,000 years ago. This staggered extinction pattern suggests a gradual ecological squeeze rather than a single catastrophic collapse. Large-bodied mammals with slow reproductive cycles are particularly vulnerable to this kind of cumulative pressure, where multiple moderate stressors combine over time. The Irish elk occupies a fascinating position in extinction studies because it highlights how visually dramatic anatomy can sometimes mislead interpretation. Early researchers were captivated by the sheer scale of the antlers and often assumed they must have been the primary cause of the species' demise. But deeper ecological and isotopic research has revealed a more complex story. The elk did not simply evolve itself into extinction. Instead, it appears to have been caught in a shifting environmental landscape where climate warming, habitat transformation, and human expansion gradually narrowed its viable ecological space. There is also an important symbolic dimension to the Irish elk. Its enormous antlers, preserved in museums across Europe, have become one of the most recognizable icons of Ice Age megafauna. They represent both the power and the vulnerability of highly specialized large mammals living in rapidly changing environments. For thousands of years, the Irish elk dominated its ecological niche across vast territories. Yet even such an imposing animal proved unable to adapt quickly enough to the combined pressures of post-glacial environmental change and growing human presence. The story of the aurochs is one of the most historically intimate extinction narratives because, unlike many vanished Ice Age giants, this animal lived alongside human civilization for thousands of years and played a direct role in the origins of one of humanity's most important domesticated species. The aurochs, scientifically known as Bos primigenius, was the wild ancestor of modern domestic cattle. For millennia, it roamed across a vast range, extending from Western Europe through the Middle East and into parts of Asia and North Africa. It was not a marginal or isolated species. It was a dominant large herbivore, deeply embedded in the ecological and cultural landscapes of early human societies. Physically, the aurochs was far more imposing than most modern cattle. Adult males could stand up to 1.8 meters at the shoulder, with long, forward-curving horns and a muscular, athletic build adapted for open and semi-forested environments. Contemporary descriptions and skeletal analysis suggest that the animal was fast-moving, highly alert, and capable of aggressive defense when threatened. Unlike modern domesticated cattle, which have been selectively bred for docility and productivity, the aurochs retained the full behavioral intensity of a wild megafaunal grazer. For thousands of years during the Holocene, aurochs populations coexisted with expanding human agricultural societies. In fact, one of the most consequential developments in human history, the domestication of cattle, emerged directly from early human interaction with aurochs populations in the Near East around 10,000 years ago. Over time, domesticated cattle spread widely across human settlements, gradually replacing the ecological and economic role once occupied by their wild ancestors. Yet the wild aurochs itself continued to survive in shrinking pockets across Europe for many centuries. The long decline of the aurochs illustrates a different extinction pattern than the rapid collapses seen in species like the passenger pigeon or Steller's sea cow. Instead of disappearing within decades, the aurochs experienced a slow but persistent contraction of its range. As agriculture expanded, forests were cleared, wetlands were drained, and human-managed landscapes increasingly dominated Europe. Large wild herbivores require extensive territory and relatively undisturbed grazing systems. As human land use intensified, suitable habitat for aurochs steadily diminished. At the same time, the animals were hunted both for meat and as symbols of prestige. Historical records from medieval Europe suggest that aurochs hunting was sometimes associated with elite status, further increasing pressure on already fragmented populations. Unlike earlier prehistoric hunters, medieval societies possessed more efficient weapons and more organized land control, making long-term survival increasingly difficult for the remaining herds. By the late Middle Ages, aurochs populations had been reduced to a few isolated refugees, most notably in the royal hunting forests of Poland. These final herds were protected for a time by legal restrictions, effectively becoming managed wildlife rather than fully wild populations. However, even this protection proved insufficient in the long run. disease transmitted from domestic cattle, continued habitat pressure, and the inherent vulnerability of such a small genetic population gradually pushed the species toward its final threshold. The last known aurochs died in 1627 in the Jaktorow forest of Poland. Unlike many prehistoric extinctions, this event occurred well within the era of written records, giving the aurochs one of the most precisely documented extinction endpoints among large European mammals. Its disappearance marked the end of the original wild lineage that had given rise to the billions of cattle that now exist worldwide. The aurochs holds a uniquely paradoxical place in human environmental history. Biologically, the species is extinct, yet genetically, its legacy persists in every domestic cow. In a sense, the aurochs did not vanish completely. It was absorbed into human agriculture and transformed into something else. This dual fate makes the aurochs different from many other extinct megafauna. It was not only eliminated by human expansion, it was also partially preserved through domestication, though in a fundamentally altered form. In recent decades, several breeding back projects have attempted to recreate animals that physically resemble the original aurochs by selectively breeding primitive cattle breeds. While some results approximate the appearance of the wild ancestor, the true aurochs, shaped by thousands of years of natural selection in wild ecosystems, is gone. Its extinction stands as a powerful reminder that domestication and survival are not the same thing. The animal that once roamed freely across Eurasia survives only in bones, historical descriptions, and the diluted genetic echo carried within modern. The story of the Falkland Islands wolf is one of the most unusual and quietly tragic extinction cases in modern zoological history, largely because it involved the disappearance of the only native land mammal of an entire island ecosystem. Known scientifically as Dusichion australis, and often referred to as the Falkland Islands wolf or wara, this animal occupied a uniquely isolated evolutionary position. It lived exclusively on the Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic Ocean, hundreds of kilometers off the coast of South America. Unlike many other island extinctions that followed long periods of human contact, the wara survived in isolation for thousands of years and then vanished astonishingly quickly after sustained human settlement began in the 19th century. Physically, the Falkland Islands wolf resembled a small to medium-sized fox-like canid with a thick coat adapted to the cool, wind-swept climate of the islands. It had relatively short legs, a bushy tail, and a generally robust build suited for traversing open grasslands and coastal terrain. In behavior, historical accounts consistently describe the animal as remarkably tame and lacking strong fear of humans. Early visitors noted that the wara could often be approached with little difficulty and in some cases was curious rather than evasive. This behavioral trait, which likely evolved in the absence of large terrestrial predators or human hunters, would ultimately become one of the species' greatest vulnerabilities. One of the most intriguing scientific questions surrounding the Falkland Islands wolf concerns how its ancestors reached the islands in the first place. The Falklands were never connected to the South American mainland by a land bridge in recent geological history. The leading hypothesis suggests that ancestral canids may have crossed over sea ice or narrow water gaps during colder periods of the late Pleistocene, eventually establishing a stable island population. Genetic analysis indicates that the wara was related to South American fox-like canids, but its long isolation allowed it to develop into a distinct species. For centuries, the wara appears to have lived in ecological balance within the Falkland Islands. With no competing land predators and limited human presence, its population remained stable. That equilibrium changed rapidly in the early 1800s when European settlers established permanent colonies on the islands. Sheep farming quickly became the dominant economic activity, and the wara was soon perceived, fairly or not, as a threat to livestock. Whether the species actually caused significant sheep losses remains debated among historians and ecologists, but perception again proved more consequential than ecological reality. By the mid-19th century, systematic efforts to eliminate the wara were underway. Settlers used poisoning campaigns, trapping, and direct shooting to reduce the population. Because the animals were both geographically confined and behaviorally unwary, these control measures were highly effective. Unlike continental predators that can retreat into remote refuges, the wara had nowhere to escape. Its entire global population existed within a limited island environment increasingly dominated by human land use. The speed of the collapse was striking. Charles Darwin himself encountered the Falkland Islands wolf during his voyage on the HMS Beagle in the 1830s and reportedly remarked on how vulnerable the species appeared in the face of expanding human settlement. His observations would later be seen as eerily prescient. Within just a few decades of sustained persecution, the population fell below viable levels. The last confirmed individual of the species was killed in 1876 on West Falkland. With that single event, the only native terrestrial mammal of the Falkland Islands disappeared completely. Unlike some extinctions that unfolded gradually over centuries, the wara's final phase was relatively compressed, making it one of the clearer examples of rapid island predator loss under human pressure. Ecologically, the disappearance of the Falkland Islands wolf likely had subtle but important ripple effects within the island ecosystem. As the only native land predator, it would have played a regulatory role in controlling certain prey populations and scavenging carrion along coastal zones. Its removal altered those dynamics in ways that are still not fully understood. Psychologically and historically, the wara represents a particularly sobering case because its extinction occurred well within the era of natural history observation. Darwin's early warning highlights a recurring pattern in environmental history. The vulnerability of island species is often recognized before effective protection is implemented. By the time the risk becomes widely acknowledged, the population may already be too small to recover. Today, the Falkland Islands wolf survives only in museum specimens. The story of the saber-toothed tiger, more accurately known as Smilodon, is one of the most iconic and widely misunderstood extinction narratives of the late Ice Age. Despite the popular nickname, Smilodon was not a true tiger and was not closely related to modern big cats such as lions or tigers. Instead, it belonged to a distinct branch of the cat family that specialized in a very different predatory strategy. For hundreds of thousands of years, Smilodon was one of the dominant large predators of the Americas, occupying a powerful ecological position within the Pleistocene megafaunal community. Its extinction near the end of the last ice age represents not a simple case of overhunting or climate change alone, but a complex intersection of environmental transformation, prey loss, and human expansion. Physically, Smilodon was built for power rather than speed. Unlike modern cheetahs or wolves that rely heavily on pursuit, Smilodon had a stocky, muscular body with exceptionally strong forelimbs and relatively short legs. This anatomy suggests an ambush hunting strategy rather than long-distance chasing. The animal's most famous feature, its elongated upper canine teeth, which could reach over 20 centimeters in length in the largest species, Smilodon populator, has often led to dramatic but sometimes inaccurate portrayals in popular culture. These saber-like teeth were not designed for bone crushing. Instead, biomechanical studies indicate they were precision tools likely used to deliver deep, targeted throat or soft tissue wounds once prey had been subdued. For much of the late Pleistocene, Smilodon thrived across a wide geographic range, from North America to southern South America. Fossil evidence from sites such as the La Brea tar pits in California reveals that the species was both widespread and ecologically successful for a long period. These tar pit deposits have preserved thousands of Smilodon remains, offering unusually detailed insight into the animal's anatomy, injury patterns, and possible social behavior. Some paleontologists have suggested that healed injuries found in certain skeletons may indicate a degree of social cooperation, although this remains debated. The beginning of Smilodon's decline appears to coincide with the broader megafaunal extinction wave that swept across the Americas roughly between 12,000 and 10,000 years ago. During this period, many large herbivores, including mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, and ancient bison species, experienced sharp population declines or complete extinction. Because Smilodon depended heavily on large prey, this ecological disruption would have placed significant pressure on its survival. Apex predators are often particularly vulnerable when prey networks destabilize, and Smilodon was highly specialized for hunting large-bodied animals. At the same time, anatomically modern humans were expanding rapidly across the Americas. Archaeological evidence confirms that early human populations hunted many of the same large herbivores that formed the core of Smilodon's prey base. While direct human hunting of Smilodon itself may have occurred occasionally, most researchers believe the more important factor was indirect competition and ecological cascade. As prey populations declined due to a combination of climate warming and human hunting pressure, the large predator community began to lose its foundation. Climate change at the end of the Ice Age also played a significant role. Rising temperatures altered vegetation patterns, fragmented open habitats, and reshaped prey distribution across the continents. Highly specialized predators often struggle to adapt quickly to such rapid environmental shifts. Smilodon's powerful but relatively inflexible ambush strategy may have become less effective as prey species declined and ecosystems reorganized. Unlike some later historical extinctions, the disappearance of Smilodon occurred before written records or direct human documentation. There are no eyewitness accounts, no photographs, and no preserved soft tissue specimens comparable to those of the woolly mammoth. Everything known about the animal comes from fossil evidence, biomechanical modeling, and ecological reconstruction. Yet despite this distance in time, Smilodon remains one of the most vividly imagined extinct predators in human culture, largely because its anatomy was so visually extreme and immediately recognizable. The extinction of Smilodon illustrates a recurring pattern in deep-time ecology. Apex predators are often among the first large animals to disappear when ecosystems undergo rapid restructuring. Their survival depends on stable and abundant prey networks, and when those networks collapse, whether due to climate, human expansion, or both, even the most formidable hunters can vanish surprisingly quickly. Today, Smilodon exists only in fossil beds and scientific reconstructions, yet its legacy continues to shape how we imagine. The story of the Pyrenean ibex is one of the most haunting modern extinction cases because it unfolded almost entirely under scientific observation and ended not in distant prehistory, but at the threshold of the 21st century. Known scientifically as Capra pyrenaica, the Pyrenean ibex, also called the bucardo, was a mountain-dwelling wild goat native to the rugged Pyrenees range between Spain and France. Unlike many extinct species that vanished before the development of modern conservation biology, the decline of the Pyrenean ibex was documented in real time, studied by researchers, and widely recognized as a conservation emergency. Yet despite this awareness, the subspecies still slipped into extinction, making its story particularly unsettling in the modern environmental narrative. Physically, the Pyrenean ibex was a robust and agile ungulate adapted to steep alpine terrain. Males possessed long, thick, backward-curving horns with pronounced ridges, while females were smaller and more lightly built. The animals were well suited to cold mountain environments, capable of navigating rocky slopes and sparse high-altitude vegetation. For centuries, ibex populations across the Iberian Peninsula had experienced pressure from hunting, but several regional subspecies survived into the modern era. The Pyrenean form, however, gradually became restricted to increasingly isolated pockets within the Spanish Pyrenees. By the 19th and early 20th centuries, the subspecies was already in visible decline. Overhunting, habitat disturbance, and competition with domestic livestock reduced numbers steadily. Although legal protections were eventually introduced in parts of its range, these measures came late and were often insufficiently enforced. By the late 20th century, the population had collapsed to just a handful of individuals. Conservationists recognized the severity of the situation, but the small population size created a biological trap. With so few animals remaining, genetic diversity plummeted, and the likelihood of natural recovery diminished sharply. By the 1990s, the entire subspecies was reduced to a single known surviving individual, a female named Celia. She lived under close monitoring in Ordesa National Park in Spain and became one of the most closely watched wild animals in Europe. Her existence represented both a symbol of last hope and a stark indicator of how narrow the margin for recovery had become. On January 6, 2000, Celia was found dead, reportedly killed by a falling tree. With her death, the Pyrenean ibex became the first mammal subspecies to go extinct in the 21st century. What makes this story even more extraordinary is what happened next. In 2003, scientists attempted one of the earliest de-extinction efforts by cloning the Pyrenean ibex using preserved genetic material. For a brief moment, the effort appeared successful. A cloned kid was born, marking the first time an extinct animal had been technically brought back to life. However, the newborn died within minutes due to lung defects. The species had, in a sense, crossed back over the biological threshold, only to vanish again almost immediately. This fleeting resurrection remains one of the most symbolically powerful moments in modern conservation history. The Pyrenean ibex illustrates a different extinction pattern than many earlier cases. It did not vanish suddenly due to industrial-scale hunting, nor was it lost in deep prehistoric climate shifts. Instead, it declined slowly in full view of modern science. Warning signs were clear, protective laws existed, monitoring systems were in place, yet the combination of late intervention, genetic bottleneck, and accumulated human pressure proved too much to reverse. In many ways, the bucardo represents the modern face of extinction, not ignorance, but delayed and insufficient response. Today, the Pyrenean ibex survives only in museum specimens, preserved DNA samples, and the brief scientific record of its attempted return. Its disappearance stands as a sobering reminder that awareness alone does not guarantee survival. Even in the age of conservation biology and genetic technology, species can still slip past the point of recovery if intervention comes too late. Among modern extinction stories, few are as quietly unsettling as the bucardo, the mountain goat that humanity tried for a moment to bring back from the edge, only to watch it disappear again into silence. The story of the Rodriguez giant tortoise is one of the most revealing examples of how quickly even long-lived, resilient island megafauna can disappear once sustained human pressure enters a previously isolated ecosystem. Native exclusively to Rodriguez Island in the Indian Ocean, part of the Mascarene archipelago east of Madagascar, These giant tortoises once existed in extraordinary numbers, shaping the ecological structure of the island for thousands of years. Unlike many continental extinctions that unfolded gradually across vast landscapes, the fate of the Rodrigues giant tortoise demonstrates the particular vulnerability of island species that evolved in environments almost completely free of large terrestrial predators. The Rodrigues giant tortoise was not a single uniform animal, but a group of closely related species within the genus Cylindraspis, most notably Cylindraspis peltastes and Cylindraspis vosmiri. These tortoises were large, slow-moving herbivores that browsed on low vegetation, fruits, and fallen plant material. Their heavy domed or saddleback shells, thick limbs, and long lifespans made them classic examples of island gigantism, a phenomenon in which isolated environments with limited predators allow certain animals to evolve much larger body sizes than their mainland relatives. For millennia, these tortoises were among the dominant ecological engineers of Rodrigues, helping disperse seeds, shape plant communities, and maintain the balance of the island's dry forest ecosystems. When European sailors and settlers first reached Rodrigues in the late 17th century, they encountered tortoise populations of astonishing density. Contemporary accounts describe landscapes where the animals were so numerous that movement across parts of the island could be physically obstructed by their presence. Like many island megafauna, the tortoises had evolved with little instinctive fear of large mammals. They moved slowly, reproduced relatively late in life, and nested on the ground, traits that were highly successful in their original predator-free environment, but catastrophically maladaptive once human exploitation began. The primary driver of the tortoise's decline was direct harvesting for food. For visiting ships in the Indian Ocean trade network, giant tortoises represented an almost perfect mobile food supply. They were easy to capture, could survive for long periods without food or water when kept alive on ships, and provided fresh meat on long sea voyages. Sailors and settlers removed them in enormous numbers. Unlike some hunted mammals, the tortoises had very slow reproductive cycles. Females required many years to reach maturity, and population recovery was inherently slow, even under stable conditions. Compounding the pressure from hunting was the ecological disruption caused by introduced animals such as rats, pigs, and goats. These invasive species damaged vegetation, trampled nesting sites, and preyed upon eggs and young tortoises. Habitat degradation accelerated as human settlement expanded, and natural vegetation was cleared. The combined effect was a classic island extinction cascade. Heavy direct exploitation paired with rapid environmental destabilization. What makes the Rodrigues giant tortoise's extinction particularly sobering is the speed of the collapse relative to the species' long evolutionary history. Within roughly a century of sustained human presence, the once abundant tortoise populations were reduced to extinction. By the early to mid-18th century, they had disappeared completely from Rodrigues. Unlike some later extinctions, this loss occurred before systematic biological monitoring, leaving much of their detailed behavior and population dynamics only partially reconstructed from historical accounts and subfossil remains. Ecologically, the disappearance of the tortoises had lasting ripple effects on the island. As major herbivores and seed dispersers, they had played a key role in maintaining plant community structure. Their removal altered vegetation patterns in ways that researchers are still working to fully understand. In recent decades, conservationists have even introduced ecological replacement tortoises, species from other islands, in an attempt to partially restore lost ecosystem functions, an unusual and telling measure of how central the original tortoises once were to the island's environmental balance. From a broader historical perspective, The Rodrigues giant tortoise exemplifies one of the most dangerous extinction profiles. Large-bodied, slow-reproducing island species encountering sudden industrial-scale human extraction. Their long lifespan and apparent abundance created a powerful illusion of resilience. Yet once the removal rate exceeded reproductive capacity, collapse became inevitable. Today, the Rodrigues giant tortoise survives only in fossil remains, historical descriptions, and ecological reconstruction. Its story stands. The extinction of the Cylindraspis giant tortoises represents one of the most comprehensive and devastating examples of island megafauna loss in the early modern era, not because a single species vanished, but because an entire evolutionary lineage was erased across multiple islands within a relatively short historical window. The genus Cylindraspis once included several species of giant tortoises that inhabited the Mascarene Islands in the Indian Ocean, primarily Mauritius, Rodrigues, and Réunion. For hundreds of thousands of years, these tortoises evolved in extreme geographic isolation, becoming some of the dominant large herbivores in their ecosystems. Their disappearance in the 17th and 18th centuries marked the complete loss of a unique branch of reptilian evolution that had persisted through countless environmental changes, but proved unable to withstand the sudden pressures of sustained human exploitation. Each island hosted its own distinct species within the Cylindraspis lineage. On Mauritius lived forms such as Cylindraspis inepta and Cylindraspis tricerata. Rodrigues was home to Cylindraspis peltastes and Cylindraspis vosmeiri, while Réunion supported its own closely related populations. Although these species varied somewhat in shell shape, with some exhibiting more domed shells and others more saddleback forms, they shared the core biological traits typical of island giant tortoises: large body size, slow maturation, ground nesting, and a long lifespan. These characteristics had allowed them to thrive in predator-poor island environments for millennia. But those same traits created extreme vulnerability once human extraction began. When European sailors reached the Mascarene Islands in the late 17th century, they encountered tortoise populations of staggering density. Historical accounts from Mauritius and Rodrigues describe landscapes where thousands of tortoises could be gathered with minimal effort. For long-distance sailing crews operating in the Indian Ocean trade routes, the animals were extraordinarily valuable. Giant tortoises could be kept alive for months aboard ships without significant food or water, providing a reliable source of fresh meat on extended voyages. As a result, harvesting quickly scaled from opportunistic capture to systematic removal. The biological structure of Cylindraspis populations made recovery extremely difficult once heavy harvesting began. Like most large reptiles, these tortoises required many years, often decades, to reach reproductive maturity. They also produced relatively small numbers of offspring compared to smaller, faster breeding animals. When large numbers of adults were removed annually, population replacement simply could not keep pace. Within only a few generations of sustained exploitation, the demographic structure of many island populations collapsed. Compounding the direct hunting pressure was the ecological disruption caused by introduced animals. Rats preyed heavily on eggs and hatchlings. Pigs rooted through nesting grounds. Goats and other livestock degraded native vegetation that tortoises depended on for food. In island ecosystems where evolutionary isolation had produced highly specialized and often fragile ecological networks, these invasive species amplified the impact of human harvesting far beyond what either factor might have caused alone. What makes the Cylindraspis extinction particularly sobering is the near totality of the loss. Unlike some other extinction events where remnant populations survived in remote refuges, The giant tortoises of the Mascarenes were systematically removed across their entire range. By the late 18th century, most species in the genus were already extinct or functionally extinct in the wild. The process unfolded quickly enough that detailed scientific study of the living animals never fully developed. Much of what is known today comes from subfossil deposits, fragmentary historical descriptions, and later anatomical reconstruction. Ecologically, the disappearance of Cylindraspis tortoises triggered long-term changes across the Mascarene Islands. As major herbivores and seed dispersers, they had played a central role in shaping vegetation patterns and maintaining certain plant life cycles. Some plant species evolved fruits and growth patterns, specifically adapted to tortoise grazing and seed dispersal. After the tortoises vanished, parts of these ecological relationships collapsed or became severely altered. In modern conservation biology, the Mascarenes are often cited as a classic example of how removing a keystone herbivore can reshape entire island ecosystems for centuries. Today, the genus Cylindraspis exists only in fossil remains, museum specimens, and ecological memory. No living descendants remain. In some areas, conservationists have introduced ecological replacement tortoises from other regions in an attempt to partially restore lost ecosystem function. The story of the Baiji River dolphin is one of the most unsettling modern extinction narratives because it did not unfold in the distant past or on a remote island, but within one of the world's most densely populated and economically vital regions. Known scientifically as Lipotes vexillifer and often called the Yangtze River dolphin, the Baiji was a freshwater cetacean that had inhabited China's Yangtze River system for millions of years. It was one of only a handful of river dolphin species in the world and represented a unique evolutionary lineage adapted specifically to the complex, sediment-heavy waters of one of Asia's great river systems. Its disappearance in the late 20th and early 21st centuries has often been described as the first extinction of a large aquatic mammal directly attributable to modern industrialization. Physically, the Baiji was highly specialized for life in the turbid waters of the Yangtze. It possessed a long, narrow beak filled with numerous teeth for catching fish, small eyes adapted to low visibility conditions, and a flexible neck that allowed precise maneuvering in shallow channels. Its pale bluish-gray coloration gave rise to the nickname Goddess of the Yangtze in local folklore, reflecting the long cultural presence of the species in Chinese riverine life. For thousands of years, the Baiji coexisted with human communities along the Yangtze without catastrophic population collapse. Traditional fishing methods and river traffic were relatively low impact compared to what would come later. The turning point for the species began in the mid-20th century as China's industrial and economic development accelerated. The Yangtze River underwent rapid transformation. Large-scale commercial shipping increased dramatically. Industrial pollution intensified. Extensive dam construction altered water flow and fish migration patterns. At the same time, widespread use of destructive fishing techniques, including electric fishing and rolling hooks, created direct mortality risks for the dolphins. Unlike marine species that can shift ranges across vast oceanic spaces, the Baiji was geographically confined to a single river system. This ecological confinement dramatically limited its ability to escape worsening conditions. By the 1970s and 1980s, scientists were already reporting significant population declines. Surveys suggested the species had fallen to only a few hundred individuals. Conservation efforts were initiated, including proposals for protected reserves and captive breeding programs, but these measures struggled against the sheer scale of environmental change occurring across the Yangtze Basin. The river itself was being rapidly industrialized faster than conservation infrastructure could adapt. As in several earlier extinction cases, awareness existed, but coordinated response lagged behind accelerating pressure. Throughout the 1990s, Baiji sightings became increasingly rare. Field researchers noted declining encounter rates despite intensified survey efforts. By the early 2000s, concern had reached critical levels within the international conservation community. In 2006, an extensive multinational survey of the Yangtze River was conducted using both visual observation and acoustic monitoring techniques. The expedition failed to find any confirmed surviving individuals. The Baiji was subsequently declared functionally extinct, meaning that even if a few individuals remained, the population was no longer considered viable for long-term survival. What makes the Baiji's disappearance particularly chilling is its temporal proximity to the modern conservation era. Unlike the dodo or the great auk, this extinction occurred during a period of advanced ecological science, satellite monitoring, and global environmental awareness. The warning signs were documented, population surveys were conducted, conservation proposals were drafted, yet the scale and speed of industrial transformation along the Yangtze outpaced protective measures. The Baiji did not vanish in ignorance. It vanished in the presence of knowledge that arrived too slowly to alter the outcome. Ecologically, the loss of the Baiji represents the removal of a top aquatic predator from one of the world's major freshwater systems. While the full long-term ecological consequences remain complex and difficult to isolate, its disappearance is widely regarded as a sentinel event, a signal of the broader environmental stress placed on large river ecosystems under rapid industrial development. Psychologically, the Baiji occupies a particularly sobering position among extinct animals. It was not a prehistoric giant. It was not an isolated island species, unknown to science. It was a modern river dolphin living alongside one of the largest human populations on Earth, and it still slipped past the threshold of recovery. Today, the Baiji survives only in preserved specimens, recorded field notes, and fading. And in the cold waters of the North Pacific, one of the ocean's gentle giants disappeared almost as quickly as it had been discovered. Steller's sea cow had survived for thousands of years in quiet isolation, grazing slowly through the kelp forests of the Commander Islands. It had no natural fear of humans, no evolutionary memory of harpoons, no instinct to flee from approaching boats. For most of its existence, it did not need to. And then the world changed. Within just a few decades of human contact, the balance that had held for millennia collapsed. The hunters came not because the animal was rare, but because it was abundant, not because it was dangerous, but because it was easy. What had once been an evolutionary advantage, calmness, size, predictability, became a fatal weakness in the face of organized human extraction. By 1768, less than 30 years after science first described it, the last Steller's sea cow was gone. No photographs, no living film, only bones, and one man's careful notes describing a creature the world would never see again. There is something uniquely unsettling about this extinction, not because it happened long ago, but because it happened so fast. Fast enough that awareness never had time to become protection. Fast enough that by the time the pattern was clear, the species was already past recovery. And that is the deeper lesson hidden beneath the waves. Extinction does not always arrive slowly. Sometimes it accelerates quietly, until suddenly there is nothing left to save. If you want more deep historical journeys into the patterns humanity keeps repeating, don't forget to subscribe to the Enigmatic Veil, like the video, and share your thoughts below. Because history rarely ends where we think it does, and sometimes the quietest disappearances carry the loudest warnings. In nature, sometimes the greatest risk is not aggression, but unaware comfort. Because a creature that recognizes danger learns slowly and painfully to survive. It learns to flee before the shadow arrives. It learns to hide before the ground begins to shake. It learns to adapt before the world fully changes. But a creature that has never known danger never develops this urgency. For thousands of years, Steller's sea cow moved peacefully through the cold, quiet waters of the North Pacific. It grazed slowly on the kelp forests, enormous yet gentle, living in an environment where large surface predators were almost non-existent. In that world, fear was not a daily necessity. It was not carved into instinct. It was not reinforced by repeated threat. And evolution, always efficient, does not build defenses that are never used. Generation after generation, the sea cow lived in relative ecological stability. Its size protected it. Its isolation protected it. Its calm environment protected it. But evolution prepares species for the past they survived, not the future that suddenly arrives. And when humans entered the North Pacific in the 18th century, they brought with them something the sea cow had never encountered before: organized, persistent, technologically amplified predation. What made the situation especially tragic was not weakness. The sea cow was not fragile in the traditional sense. It was massive, thick-skinned, and well adapted to its cold marine environment. For millennia, it had been a successful giant, but success in one ecological era can become vulnerability in the next. The same traits that once ensured its stability, slow movement, predictable behavior, lack of fear, suddenly became catastrophic liabilities in the presence of human hunters. When the boats approached, the sea cows did not scatter in panic. When the harpoons struck, many remained nearby rather than fleeing far into open water. They had no evolutionary memory of this kind of threat. No inherited urgency to escape quickly from surface predators, no behavioral script for a danger that had never existed in their world. And so the response came too slowly. History reveals a deeply unsettling pattern here. Extinction does not always remove the most aggressive, the most violent, or the most visibly vulnerable. Sometimes it quietly selects the unprepared, the species whose past environment was too stable, the species whose warning systems were never fully tested, the species that had no reason, until it was too late, to expect the world to change so suddenly. Comfort, when it lasts long enough, can dull the edge of survival. Vigilance, when rarely needed, begins to fade. Adaptation, when not constantly exercised, slows beneath the surface. And when rapid change finally arrives, whether through climate, human expansion, or technological pressure, the response window may already be too narrow. This is what makes the disappearance of Steller's sea cow more than just another extinction event. It is a case study in evolutionary timing. It is a reminder that survival is not only about strength or size or past success. It is about readiness for the kind of change that has not happened yet. And perhaps most unsettling of all, this pattern is not confined to the 18th century. It is a recurring law of ecological history, because in nature, and sometimes in human systems too, the greatest danger is not always the visible threat on the horizon. Sometimes the greatest danger is the long period of calm that came before it. Why does the human brain so often assume that abundance means permanence? Why do people look at something vast, something seemingly endless, and quietly conclude that it cannot disappear? The answer lies deep in the way the human mind evolved to interpret risk, time, and survival pressure. For most of human history, the brain was not optimized to detect slow depletion. It was optimized to detect immediate danger: the predator in the grass, the sudden storm, the rival tribe approaching the horizon. In evolutionary terms, survival favored those who reacted quickly to sharp threats, not those who carefully modeled gradual decline. As a result, the human mind developed a powerful but dangerous shortcut: When something appears abundant, it feels stable. When it feels stable, it feels safe. Psychologists often describe this through mechanisms similar to normalcy bias and the availability heuristic. The brain heavily weights what it sees repeatedly in the present. If a resource is consistently visible in large quantities, the mind quietly projects that pattern into the future. Yesterday it was plentiful. Today it is still plentiful. So the intuitive conclusion becomes, tomorrow it will remain plentiful. This is not careful reasoning. It is cognitive efficiency. And in many historical cases, it has been catastrophically wrong. Part of the problem is mathematical. The human brain is surprisingly poor at intuitively grasping exponential decline. Many collapses in nature do not begin dramatically. They begin slowly, almost invisibly. Populations shrink a little, then a little more. Then suddenly the curve steepens. And by the time the decline becomes emotionally obvious, the biological recovery window may already be closing. This creates one of the most dangerous illusions in environmental history, the long plateau before the fall. During this plateau, everything appears stable enough to continue exploitation, and that illusion has repeated itself again and again across the historical record. The dodo of Mauritius once seemed abundant to early visitors. Passenger pigeons once darkened the skies of North America in flocks so vast they appeared limitless. Steller's sea cows filled the cold waters of the North Pacific in numbers that seemed inexhaustible. The great auk nested in dense colonies along North Atlantic coasts. In each case, observers made a similar silent assumption: there is still plenty left. In each case, the decline accelerated faster than human intuition was prepared to recognize. What the brain reads as stability is often only a temporary surface condition. There is also a deeper psychological comfort embedded in abundance. Humans are naturally resistant to the idea that large systems can collapse quickly. Accepting that possibility requires cognitive effort and emotional discomfort. It is far easier and far more mentally economical to assume continuity. This tendency creates a dangerous delay between the first warning signs and meaningful response. By the time concern becomes widespread, the underlying population dynamics may already be approaching a critical threshold. History shows that this pattern has repeated not once, but many times. Species that appeared overwhelmingly numerous vanished within a few human generations. Fisheries that once seemed infinite collapsed within decades. Forests that stretched beyond the horizon were reduced within a century. The common thread is not ignorance alone. It is a structural feature of human perception. The brain is calibrated for sudden threats, but extinction is often a slow-moving process that accelerates quietly beneath the surface. This is why the illusion of "there is still plenty" has been one of the most dangerous assumptions in environmental history. Abundance is not immunity, visibility is not security, and stability, when observed only at the surface, can be profoundly misleading. Because in both nature and human systems, collapse rarely announces itself at the beginning. It approaches gradually, patiently, and often invisibly, until the moment when recovery is no longer possible and the once abundant presence becomes a historical memory. And so, one by one, they disappeared, not always in fire, not always in catastrophe, sometimes in silence. The dodo stopped walking its island paths. The mammoth vanished into melting ice. The thylacine paced behind bars, and then no more. The baiji swam the Yangtze for millions of years, until the river grew too loud. History often tells us about empires that fell, kings who ruled, and battles that changed the world. But just as important and far more quiet are the lives that faded while humanity was busy building its future. Extinction is rarely a single moment. It is a process, a narrowing. a series of small pressures that, over time, become irreversible. And the most unsettling truth is this. In many of these stories, we were already watching. We had the reports, we had the warnings. Sometimes, we even had the last photograph. Yet still, the silence came. But history is not only a record of loss, it is also a mirror. Because the question these animals leave behind is not only what happened to them, but also, what patterns are we repeating now? Which warnings are we ignoring today? And how many species are quietly approaching the same edge? While the world looks elsewhere? If this story made you pause, if it made you see history a little differently, and if you want more deep, unsettling journeys into the hidden patterns of the past, subscribe to the Enigmatic Veil. Because here, we don't just tell history, we uncover the mechanisms behind it. New historical and philosophical deep dives are coming. Stories that most channels overlook, patterns most people miss, and questions that still matter today, until the next veil is lifted.